Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Farnsworth. My name is Gwendolyn Loomis-Smith. I'm the Phyllis Wyeth Director of Learning Engagement. And I just want to thank you all for coming this evening. We have a very special lecture tonight with Rachael Cerrotti. We share the same sky as the book that she'll be talking about tonight. So I want to really thank our members, our soon-to-be members, our supporters, and our friends at Adas Yoshuron, and those joining us online tonight from your living rooms in Maine and also out of state. Adas Yoshuron is down the street here in Rockland, Maine, and I just wanted to let you know this is a wonderful partnership with them that we are doing for this special lecture. And so if you'd like to join us in thanking them, please do. I want to also thank in particular Rachel Adler, who I met just a few weeks ago over a cup of tea. It was one of these mid-coast Maine days that seems to want to promise spring, but not quite, kind of like today. And we just talked back and forth for a really long time about these wonderful ideas of how we could partner together during our Leonard Baskin exhibition, which just opened up just a couple of weeks ago. And our Leonard Baskin exhibition is curated by Jane Bianco. So I want to thank Rachel for helping to put together tonight's event as it marks the observance of the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is tomorrow, April 28th. And any event like this, as you can imagine, always takes a village. And I want to thank our village here at the Farnsworth as well. We are joined tonight by Janice Gates, Director of Operations, who you likely met upstairs. Janice was, in fact, probably trying to sell you a book, and Rachel will be signing books later on this evening. And I also wanted to thank our ever dynamic and creative learning and engagement team who is here this evening. Catherine Carlick, who is at the registration desk, she is our learning engagement coordinator. And then also Alexis Saba, who is our school programs manager, who is assisting with our hybrid online program. And in the back, you'll also see Scott Sell, who is our filming expert, who is also helping to run the online streaming this evening. So I want to thank all of our friends, community members, and supporters who make what we do here at the Farnsworth possible and help us move forward artfully. Tonight, after our lecture with Jane Bianco and author Rachael Cerrotti, we'll be taking some questions from the audience and online. So if you are online, be sure to put your questions in the Q&A box. We'll be happy to answer them. And then also, if you're obviously in your room, just wave the hand and we'll be happy to answer your question. So now I would like to present to you Jane Bianco. Jane is our interim chief curator here at the Farnsworth, who curated the ever poignant exhibition on Leonard Baskin's I Hold the Cracked Mirror Up to Man. Jane.
I will just echo what Gwendolyn said. Thank you so much for coming. And I'll just make a slight correction. I'm not a lecturer tonight. I would rather say that this is a wonderful, wonderful book. It has great meaning for me. The more I read it, the more I slowed down. I savored every chapter, usually before coming to work during early mornings. And I'm very much an admirer of the author and the way she connected the past to the present to the future, linking the past to the present, linking the present to the past. And the most meaningful title, which had such impact when I finally read the words towards the end of the book, We Share the Same Sky. This is a wonderful, wonderful book, and congratulations.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you. Hi. Thank you for being here with me tonight. This is my first in-person talk in Maine, and it feels really exciting to be here in Mid-Coast. I live in Portland, Maine. I moved up here about 1.5 years ago from the Boston area, where my parents still are, and I don't know how thrilled they are that I say I don't regret it for a minute that I left them to come up here. But my family, we have a home up in Northport, which my parents bought some land there before I was even born. So Midcoast feels like home to me as well, and has a place in the book, which is where I'm going to start. So, but first of all, to everyone at the museum, Rachel, for making this possible tonight. Thank you all for being here. So we share the same sky. Tonight, I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey into my grandmother's wartime history. She was a Holocaust survivor. She was the only survivor in her family to be alive at the end of the war, on her own from the age of 14. And you'll learn through her story that while there's a lot of tragedy and sadness in it, and it's important that we talk about that on this Holocaust Remembrance Day, it's also an uplifting story. And that's the way she called it herself. So start with my grandmother, Hana. I specifically chose this picture for this presentation because this is her up on Knights Pond in Northport. So that is where we spent lots of time together. My grandmother was from the Philadelphia area. That's how I knew her, where she was from. I grew up in Boston. And when I started going through her diaries, one of the things that I noticed that she would write about was that visiting me and my brother was like tourism. And that wasn't true with any of the other grandkids, but because we were far away, it always felt like a travel adventure with her, which was, I think, set the stage for us to have some travels together later in life. And when I say that, I wasn't with her, but I was with her story. But also coming up here to Maine was a set of travels. And so I actually wanted to start with just reading a piece of the book that I don't normally read, but I felt like it was poignant being up here Midcoast. So back when I was like 3 years old in 1992, my grandmother wrote me a letter, and you can actually see the handwriting kind of faint behind this photograph here. And this picture, I'm pretty sure this was also up here in Maine. But she writes me when I was like 3 years old. She writes me this handwritten back and forth letter that's multiple pages long that essentially is telling me all about the world. And so I wanted to start with that letter just to set the stage tonight, because it's quite interesting that she wrote this to a 3-year-old. So it was August 8th, 1992. She writes, "Dearest Rachel, do you miss me? I miss you terribly. It's a week since I saw you. I miss you running into me and goring me with your head and then laughing with delight. What a beautiful laugh you have. Your entire being is full of joy and delight, and your cunningness takes me by surprise. I miss seeing you eating with such a hearty appetite. As your Ima says, you eat as if you were a teenage boy. You're sturdy in body and spirit, full of confidence in your abilities as you want to do everything for yourself, by yourself, yet at the same time, you're social and love interaction. You can distinguish the beautiful from the mundane. Where did you learn to comment, to give compliments on clothing? I not only miss your smile and your laugh, but also your frown and your curiosity. Do you remember we slept together in the cabin? Do you remember me reading the book one morning in Maine, and you, knowing it by heart, kept correcting me? We read by flashlight under the sleeping bag, and when your eyes were closed, I stopped reading only to be told in a commanding tone to continue. Yes, we were all in your parents' cottage for 1 week. Jesse, who was a delight, that's my brother, your father, your Ima, Rebecca for a few days, your Aunt Nina and your cousins, Ilana, Yoel, and Danielle, with whom you had several fights for possessions, Bernd and myself. What a crowd. It was so much fun and pleasure. I often think how lucky I am, how lucky Ima is, how lucky you are, having such a loving, extended family. Your Ima didn't have the pleasure of, nor the luxury of having grandparents. She, as well as Aunt Nina and Uncle Peter, had only a nuclear family. When you're much older and I'm still around, I'll tell you about it. The world was bad, crazy, and vengeful then. And today, half a century later, it's not better by much. People will always fight for one reason or another and kill each other. We're in August 1992. We had presidential elections. George Bush is president and wants to be again next term. Bill Clinton, Democrat, is running against him. The 25th Olympic Games are taking place in Barcelona, Spain. In Somalia, children by the hundreds are dying of hunger and illness. Israel has a new prime minister, Rabin, who is more willing to give into Palestinian demands than his predecessor, Shamir, was. There's a terrible civil war in Yugoslavia. Serbs are killing Croats and vice versa. Small children are killed and are separated from their parents for no reason and no fault. They didn't do anything bad. You are lucky to live in a country where you are protected by us all. You'll grow up to be as compassionate as your parents, who are concerned about the human race as well as the environment, which is getting polluted. In the cottage in Maine, which is a beautiful state, we forget about it all. The outside world didn't even listen to the radio. We just enjoyed each other, and mainly, I enjoyed so much spending the precious week with you. I am so grateful for it. I am only sorry that you live so far away and I cannot see you more often. Hope to see you soon. With all my love, Mati. So I was 3 years old when she wrote that. And I think it's a testament to who she was and the way that she started leaving breadcrumbs about her story very early on. So fast forward many, many years, and I'll say I didn't know that that letter existed until after she passed away, and I found it. But many years later, I went to college in Philadelphia. I didn't quite choose the right school for me. All I wanted to do was be a photojournalist. That was my plan. So school felt a little constricting for me, but I had gone to school in Philadelphia, which was nearby my grandmother. And so we started these storytelling sessions together. I asked her, I said, Muti, will you tell me your story? She was like, oh, you've heard it before, which I had. She was a very vocal speaker. I was like, yeah, but I don't know. I was curious, like, how would she tell it differently to a granddaughter than she would tell it to other people? So we started these sessions and they were very, very informal. I didn't really have any large plans of what I would do with it. I just felt like, oh, it'd be nice to have this written down. So we did that for about a year, a little bit more than a year, until she passed away in the fall of 2010. And after she passed away, I was in my final year of college and realized that she left behind this absolutely gorgeous archive. It's like when our time is up at any point, we leave behind possessions. And so I was saying my grandmother's archive was not a secret archive. There's a lot of family stories out there, particularly with wartime pasts, where stories are not spoken about, they're not known, and then somebody passes away and you discover everything you didn't know. And that wasn't this. But my grandmother did leave her story behind with intention, in a sense. And so this was one of the folders I found. And actually, this is where I found that letter. And it says, for Rachel and Jesse, so you'll know a little about my life when I was your age. Love, Mati. So this was my permission in. And so I graduated college, I moved back to Boston, and I essentially dubbed myself like the unofficial family historian. So I just took everything and I started to digitize it. And so in my early 20s, I did all the things that young creatives do. I worked at restaurants and photographed weddings and worked with travel programs and every odd and job to make a little bit of money. And meanwhile, I was starting to take this really deep dive into my grandmother's story. And it slowly, well, actually not so slowly, it started becoming an obsession pretty quickly. And what I was most interested in when I began was not necessarily the history of the Holocaust. That was a piece of it, and obviously a major piece of it. But I was really taken by the idea of statelessness and displacement. And that was my first interest, because my grandmother was stateless for 17 years. And that was what I wanted to understand better. So as I was going through her documents, I mean, you can see here there were deportation papers and report cards from when she was a child in Prague. And there were birth certificates and pieces of creative writing that were marked up with line edits from teachers and envelopes with addresses on them. And this one on the right down here is a little autograph book from when she moved to America that her friends in Sweden, that's jumping way ahead in the story. But this was all the stuff that I found. And what I was paying attention to was, where was she? Who was she with? How did she get there? And I essentially started to build out a timeline of her life. And then there were the photographs. And being that I was, very determined to be a photographer, these certainly took me in, and I started to scan everything. And my grandmother was really good about writing captions and paying attention to who was in the photographs. And so these became part of piecing together the timeline. And then there were also her diaries. And for anybody who has inherited a family member's diary, you understand the weight and responsibility of having somebody's words that they've written to themselves. And I started to go through them. And this was a piece of writing that I found that she wrote in 1990. And I'll read it for you in a moment, but I'll say that prior to in her diary, the words that come before this is a little rant that she gave because she, like I said, she was a vocal speaker. She would go speak to communities, and she had just spoken to a high school class about her Holocaust survival story. And when the teacher introduced her, she made this whole big speech about how Holocaust survivors are dying. And so, we have this woman here to tell you her story. And so she writes a little rant in her diary of like, that is so rude. And I am very much alive and I'm very much here. And, and I always think about that because like people still sometimes introduce Holocaust survivors that way and nobody likes it. So my grandmother had a whole rant about that. And then she goes into this beautiful piece of writing and she writes, what does it mean to these young people? What impression do they walk away with? What compassion and understanding do they feel toward an unprecedented event, an incomprehensible Black page in history, so long, long time ago? This doesn't concern them at all. They cannot passively relate to this horror. They have their own problems to cope with, and the teenagers are in the stage of life where the most important thing is themselves. They love their own problems. What does my life, my experience for that matter, my lost generation mean to them? And it's this last line, what does my life, my experience for that matter, my lost generation mean to them, that for me to this day drives the work that I do. I think this is a question that will never actually be answered, but it's a very guiding question for doing this type of work where you're trying to understand what role does the past play in our present day lives. And it's not only my guiding question for when I work with stories like my grandmother's, but it's also guiding questions for every survivor story or every victim story I'm working with, including, refugees of today, which I do a lot of work with. And because this is the question, and it doesn't just pertain to war stories. It's all of our stories. What do those who came before us, how do they play into our lives today? What do we know about them? Also, what do we not know about them? So this photograph is for my grandmother and myself, one of the most precious possessions in this archive, but I'm gonna let you listen to her talk about it. And so you'll get to hear a little bit of her voice here.
This picture was even in the newspaper in Prague, and it was, first it was like a quiz show. There are 3 mothers and 3 grandmothers and 3 daughters and 1 great grandmother and 1 great granddaughter. How many people all together? And the next day it was like the picture in Prague. So I'm really very proud of that picture, and I'm so happy that I have it. On the right is my great grandmother, Raichova. Then is my grandmother, my mother's mother, Maria Fialova. Then it's my mother, I think she was 23 years old. Then Emilia Dubova, and then it's me, Hana Dubova. All except me perished in concentration camp.
So I spent all these years going into this archive, about 3 to 4 years before I started to conceptualize this project, that I was going to go out and retrace my grandmother's story. Because I always said I could, like, as a writer, I could have just written a book about her life, a biography, without ever leaving my bedroom with the amount that she left behind. But that wasn't really what I was interested in. I had this other layer that I was curious about, but mostly as a photographer, you can't produce a photo book sitting in your bedroom. And ironically, I've not actually made a photo book yet, but that was my driving force. Was I'm going to go out. I need to go to these places. And so after a few stages of development, it became I'm going to go out for a year and retrace my grandmother's 17 years of statelessness. So I'm going to go to the places that she lived. I'm going to try to engage in the type of life she lived in. Very aware of, the differences in our life. I was not a refugee. I had a credit card. I had a loving family. I was in a relationship that was beginning at that time. But I wanted to go. I really wanted to see the places. I really wanted to understand the culture. I wanted to look into the history of all these different countries, because I knew that my grandmother was saved by the kindness of strangers. And I knew she had to go from one country to the next over and over and over again. And I wanted to understand, what are these places? What does it feel like to be there? So it started in Prague. My grandmother was born in a small town in Kolín, about 45 minutes or so by train from Prague. But when she was 1 year old, the family moved, picked up, left the in-laws, and came to the big city. So Czechoslovakia was a country that was established in 1918 at the end of World War I. My grandmother was born in 1925. Czechoslovakia was democratic. It was artsy. I mean, we have Kafka and great thinkers, and really, really prided itself on its democracy, on its open-mindedness. It was a fairly secular culture. My grandmother grew up, as she would call it, a high holiday Jew, which is essentially, the equivalent of a Christian who goes to church on Easter and Christmas. Like, they would go for the major holidays, weddings, bar mitzvahs. They did not keep kosher. They did not speak Yiddish. And I think that was a very important piece to my grandmother's story that she emphasized, because to understand that it wasn't just Jews were not just persecuted for their religion. That wasn't what it was about. So for her, she was like, we were assimilated. We were part of the Czech community. Her friend group was diverse. But so life for her was a really lovely existence in Prague growing up. And so I went back and I spent time in this place, and I didn't really know what to do there totally and completely, but it was because there was nothing really left of my family history. So I would spend Friday nights with various Jewish communities and try to understand, what does it mean to be part of a Jewish community in a post-communist culture? Because now the Czech Republic, they're dealing not only with their World War II past with the Jewish population that was, almost completely wiped out, but then they had communism for decades afterwards. So it's a different type of oppression with that. So I found my family history in museums and in memorials and on plaques. And so, for example, the Pinka Synagogue, which all these names that line the walls of the synagogue are all names of Czech Jewish victims during the war. So if I looked really closely, I could find my great-grandparents and my grandmother's brother. But this was really how the family history existed in Czech Republic when I was there. I was following this story, and I was trying to learn the history. And so throughout my grandmother's entire growing up, the whole notion, right, she said she was born in 1925. Hitler comes to power in 1933. Hitler came into power democratically, which is very important. But within 6 months, he turned a democracy into a one-party dictatorship. All it took was 6 months for him to dismantle democracy. This was 1933. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws come into place. Anti-Semitism is rising in Germany. There's increasing persecution, humiliation, concentration camps are being built. And meanwhile, in Czechoslovakia, the words that were repeated over and over was, it can never happen here. Not in our democracy. It can never happen here. And that's what my grandmother remembered. In 1938, the fall of 1938, there was something called the Munich Agreement that was signed, which essentially Hitler was coming to the powers that be in Europe and was saying, there's this area of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland, and this is ethnically German, and it is our right to have it. And if you give us the Sudetenland, there'll be peace. We will not come for war. So a bunch of European leaders came together and said, okay, we're going to give Hitler the Sudetenland. The Czech leadership wasn't even invited to these negotiations. And so they gave it to Hitler, and 6 months later, he took all of Czechoslovakia. And then 6 months after that, World War II begins. So by the time the Munich Agreement was signed, a month later, Kristallnacht happens. And now it's clearly it can happen here, right? That notion is broken. So everybody is trying to get out. But it's not only is it hard to get out, but where do you go to? So my grandmother was lucky in the sense that for the young people, there were rescue missions put into place. The Kindertransport is probably the most famous one that was able to take young Czech Jews, and not just Czechs, but from other countries as well, out of Czechoslovakia and into other countries. And so my grandmother was able to get out of Czechoslovakia when she was 14 years old by virtue of being part of the Zionist youth movement. And the way she described the Zionist youth movement to me at that time, it was like summer camp. It was where she met her friends. It was where, they flirted and learned agricultural skills and were pioneers. And the idea was that the Zionist youth movement collaborated with a group called the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which still exists to this day, as well as the Danish government, which had agreed to take in a set number of Czech Jewish teens. And they were going to put them on foster farms in Denmark, and eventually they would go on to Palestine. And that was the idea of how to get them out of Czechoslovakia. So as my grandmother said to me, this is now October 1939, 1 month after World War II begins, she says, I last saw my parents on the platform of the train station. I thought the war will be over soon. I never believed, and I don't think they ever believed, that this is the last time that we see each other. And I think one of the ways that my grandmother was such a gifted storyteller is that, one, she knew her audience. In a sense, her stories to me were very full of travel and adventure. You know, like I said, from the time I was young, she saw me in her life as like kind of a sense of tourism and travel and adventure. But you know, whenever you're telling a story to anybody, you have the choice of, you can start at the end where you know what happens and work backwards, or you can start at the beginning. And the feelings, the emotions are so different depending where your starting point of a story is. So we could have started with 6 million Jews died, my entire family was murdered, I was on my own from that point on. Or we could start with, we had no idea what was coming next. And that was how my grandmother started telling me her story, which was, we never could have believed that this was the last time that we would see each other. And she also admitted, which I think for her was a bit of a tough, thing to admit, was she was kind of excited. This was sort of an adventure. She was 14 years old. She had never left the country before. She had just gotten her first kiss a couple months before, and the boy who gave her the kiss was with her, and it was like a whole thing. And, she was with her friends, and, that sense of adventure is also a sense of, being naive and not knowing what was coming. But, so I think that was, I've heard that from a number of survivors too, that this looking back can be very complicated in that way because of what you didn't know at the time. So when I was traveling around Europe, I said, okay, I need to travel in the same modes of transportation to the best of my ability. And I wanted to transfer at the same train stations. I really wanted to physically follow in her footprints. And meanwhile, I was rereading all of the letters and diaries and documents and creative writing she left behind. And I was looking at all the photographs she left behind. And so this is a piece of her writing that she wrote in 2004. When she was older, she took a class called Memories and Memoirs. And she wrote this piece of writing called Stepping Stones in My Life. And it's reflecting back on leaving Czechoslovakia. And this is just an excerpt of it. She writes, how much anxiety, energy, and weight was spent in obtaining this document, which does not even have my proper nationality or my name. My father and I stood for 48 hours in Gestapo headquarters in a miles-long line to obtain an exit permit for me, stamped in the issued passport. We found out that it is a German passport, as Protectorate Bohemia and Moravia, as we were under Nazi occupation and lost our independence. My name was not Hana, but Sarah, as all the Jewish females were renamed Sarah, and the Jewish males Israel. The passport cover and all the following pages had a huge red J across, indicating Jew. So I followed my grandmother out of Czechoslovakia and through Germany. I transferred trains in Berlin, and I got to a small town called Warnemünde, a small fishing village. And from here, I boarded a boat and went over to Denmark. And my grandmother arrives in Denmark in the fall of 1939. Denmark is a free country, so she is safe and she is saved. And those are her words. For this next little bit, I need some audience participation, if you guys don't mind. I'm going to show you a series of photographs. I'm going to spend about 10 seconds on each one. And if you could just yell out through your masks, just what you see. There's no wrong answer here. It's completely an observe activity. And if you're on Zoom, you can put it into the chat so other folks can see what you write, if that's a function we have for this talk. So you just yell out what you see. Fun. Kids at play, yeah. Summer. I'm gonna throw gossip in there for you guys. Friends, yeah. Silliness. Dancing for sure. Cows, yeah. Countryside, absolutely. Laughter. Teenagers, yeah. Flirting. Weeding, yeah. Yeah. Farming. Bucolic, nice. I like that word. Got one more here. Secrets, yeah. Coupling. Yeah, I like flirting for this one too. Yeah, at ease, sure. All right, thank you all for participating with me. I go back to the beginning here. I asked for this call and response for all these photographs, no matter who I'm talking to, what age group, and the one word nobody ever says is refugees. So these are all the young Czech teens that my grandmother left Czechoslovakia with. And I think it's very important that we don't say refugees, because we don't want to boil people down to their biographies the way that, we would write. And oftentimes when people get the identity of refugee, it tends to come first, right, in their list of identities, how we refer to them. And the word refugee was not used as frequently, or I don't even really know if ever, to be entirely honest, back then the way we use it now. Like now it feels like the word refugee comes out so many times a day in so many situations, but that's what they were. They were young Jewish refugees living in Denmark during the war. Everything else you said out loud, or whatever you thought in your head and didn't say out loud, is all true too. Right? Because this is the start of like me understanding the duality that lives in all of these stories so deeply. It is true. Yes, they are running from home and they are flirting with each other, right? Like for most of these kids, I can tell you that I'd say about 95% of them would be the only survivors in their family at the end of the war. But they were also gossiping. And they're trying to figure out how to be teenagers. They're growing into women and men under this big theater of war. So they get to Denmark in this fall of 1939, and by April of 1940, Denmark is occupied. So now these kids, like the kids are 14, 15 years old, they've now been occupied twice in just over a year. But the occupation in Denmark was very different than other places in Europe. I'm not going to do a long history lesson here, but the history is in the book as well as the podcast. But Denmark essentially had occupation light, as I like to call it. Hitler came in and he saw Denmark as being the ideal German protectorate, like the ideal protectorate under Nazi world order. Of course, there was the aspect that, blonde hair and blue eyes, but Denmark also had high food production, which is very important during war, that soldiers are fed. So there were some very strategic reasons for Hitler to have a good relationship with Denmark. And so when they occupied, they also agreed that they would leave the Danish constitution intact. And the Danish constitution stated that no group of people should be treated differently than any other group of people. So the Germans understood that if they came for the Jews, the Danes would uprise, because that meant the constitution was being broken and it meant that their agreement was null and void. So the Jews were left alone. So all these kids in the countryside were fairly, life was pretty good. My grandmother said that she was eating so much like bacon and fat and cream that her shirts didn't fit anymore. And, she was getting heavy for the first time in her life. And the kids were at different farms. That boy that she came over who had just given her first kiss, she actually coordinated with another friend to switch families before they got there so she could be near the boy. And then later in life was like, don't do that. That was a bad idea. That relationship didn't work out. And she was like, I was away from all my friends. And, but so even during this time of war, they could have chutzpah and they could have just choices and decision making. And they were meeting each other every so often, and they were learning Danish and still getting to speak Czech with each other. And they were also getting to celebrate some Jewish holidays together. And what I think is so interesting also, having grown up in a Reform community, as a fairly secular inner city girl, it was so interesting hearing my grandmother talk about her Judaism at this time, because for the most part, she and I seem to have had kind of similar Jewish upbringings in a sense. And it seemed like when she left, when suddenly the persecution was based off of the Judaism became that much more important. Or suddenly the holidays became more important. So they would get together. So in this photograph, they are celebrating Hanukkah. And what's so cool about this picture actually was that many years ago, I was in Israel and I met this boy in the middle here when he was a much older gentleman. And he's since passed away, but this was 10 years or so ago. And I met him at his home in Jerusalem, and I got to go through his photo albums with him because, he knew my grandmother and all this stuff. And in it, he had this picture. And so I have a picture of his hand holding this picture. And so it was cool. So as I started to dig into this project and I started to travel around the world, I would meet these people who escaped with my grandmother and go into their family photo albums and see my grandmother and start to piece it together from all of these different spaces. So my grandmother's diaries during this time are really like reminiscent of a teenage girl's diaries. She's like, this boy and I broke up, and why doesn't he love me? But I don't love him. And now there's this other boy, and this friend is stupid. And no, she's not. She's my best friend. She's not my best friend. Like all these teenagers things were coming out. And there wasn't so much mention of war in the beginning. And then time continues. They weren't supposed to be in Denmark for that long. They were supposed to go on. So they were in each home for 6 months, each foster family they were assigned to. They had 6 months and then they had to move because that was the way that the organization worked. So by September of 1940, she's been in Denmark for almost a year. She's on her second farm now. And she writes in her diary, she writes, "All those things one once had and took for granted become so precious when we lose them. And then we are sorry for not acknowledging them and not making the most of them. The same goes for me. Only now that I am abroad, I can see what motherly love meant to me. Not that I wouldn't be independent or missed her helpful hands at work. No, there's something else that's lacking, and that's a mother herself. I think that especially in my age, when I am growing up, I need a mother the most." So you start to see some reality sink in as time goes on. So during this time, my grandmother is exchanging letters with her parents in Czechoslovakia. So incredibly, we have some of those letters. And so you can actually see on the envelopes, though, you have the Nazi seal of approval here, stamped with the swastika and the eagle, and every single piece of correspondence was censored. So there were letters going back and forth, but there were sentences blacked out because, certain information couldn't go. But at least they knew that the other was alive. So these were the early years, but I'm going to let my grandmother tell you about that. This video might have a little lag, but I think it's going to work. And so this is a clip from my grandmother's testimony that she gave in 1998 to USC Shoah Foundation, which is an archive of over 50,000 Holocaust survivor testimonies. Their archive is actually encompasses far more than just Holocaust survivors. There's over 55,000 testimonies from genocide survivors from the 20th and now 21st centuries. But this was taken. So if anybody has listened to the We Share the Same Sky podcast and you've heard my grandmother's voice, this is the interview that comes from. So this is her talking about exchanging those letters in the early years of the war.
What were your parents saying about their lives in Prague?
I still have all the letters from my parents after all these years, and I promised myself I would translate them to English. I start and then I stop, and then a year later I start and I stop. I just don't know. I really haven't finished it. I knew, as I told you before, there was another family moved in. I knew that my grandparents were gone. I knew that the business was gone. I knew from my brother, he says, maybe I lived to my bar mitzvah. And even though he was secular, it was really one of the milestones in the life. He was learning his Torah portion. I don't know how but that never came to pass. I knew it was bad. But nobody ever in the wildest dream thought about what we know today about concentration camp. It was the most fun. I mean, horror movies that existed, Frankenstein existed, but nobody would ever imagine anything like this, ever in your wildest dream. It was beyond. And that's, I think, what was so successful. It was beyond understanding, behind comprehension.
Eventually, the letters stopped coming. In 1942, my great-grandparents, my grandmother's parents, and her younger brother, Peter, were deported. These were them. These are some of the final photographs I have of them. They were deported first to Theresienstadt, which was a concentration camp not so far from Prague, and then deported east to Sobibor, which was an extermination camp in occupied Poland. And the Nazis had concentration camps and extermination camps, and concentration camps like Auschwitz were places that, there was a chance to work. And with a chance to work, there was a chance to survive. and extermination camps, you went and you died. And my grandmother said actually that, like, you know, maybe they saved themselves a lot of suffering by going to an extermination camp, because it was fairly certain they died right away. So my grandmother described the Holocaust like this. You are slowly being peeled off like an onion. You are slowly losing first your privacy, your schooling, your income, your possessions. You are being conditioned to worse and worse situations. You are saying, this too shall pass. We can live with this. But you are being conditioned to live a subhuman life. And when you are looked at like subhumans, no one has trouble killing you. So this was 1942, they're deported. Imagine it was 4 or 5 years before that, they were saying it can never happen here. That's how quickly this all happened. But my grandmother's story was an uplifting one. In one of the final letters she writes to her family, July of 1941, she writes home to them, "You cannot imagine how important is a place where people live, how much influence it gives, how it is transforming. Here I am walking every day and singing, and I do not miss anything. Of course, it is not perfect, but when I came here, I felt like home. It is so fine like at home, so fine, so trustful and open. I don't have any other word than home." So summer of 1941, my grandmother had just turned 16 years old. So now she's been in Denmark for what, a little over 2 years? Yeah, somewhere around 2 years. And so she's now gone from multiple families. So not only are her diaries filled with the boys and the friends and the longing and the activities and the languages, they're also filled with information about the families that she's living with. And through this, you get this really interesting lens of, all of these people were giving her refuge. They were all giving her home. The agreement was that in exchange for room and board, she would work. But you see through these relationships that just the very, kind of mundane ways that we, the simple ways that we treat each other on a day-to-day basis make such a big difference in one's own like spiritual and emotional resilience and resistance. And so when she was living with a family that treated her, like a young girl that she was okay. She was doing all right. But then there were certain families that really treated her like a servant, like she was the help. And you can just see her mental health go so far down. So summer of 1941, my grandmother gets moved to this home of this woman named Jensine Nygaard. And Jensine was 21 years old. Hana was 16, that's not that far apart. Jensine had just been married. She had just had her first child. And when Hana moves into her home, Jensine treats her like she's part of the family. And it changes everything for Hana. This is Jensine hugging my mom back in 2013. That's me in the back. And this is Knid Arne on the left, which is Jensine's youngest of 5. And my grandmother took care of Jensine's eldest of 5. And so back when I started doing all this work through kind of like the magical powers of like the web of storytelling and journalism, which I won't take you on the deep web of it, we were connected to this family. And I will say, I wish I could take responsibility for finding this family because that would make me feel really good at my job. But it was actually Knid Arne who did it because he noticed a newspaper article in their local Danish newspaper about this group of kids that had been there during the war, that was written by a Czech journalist. And he said, "Oh, I've heard a story like that throughout my whole life. My mother tells a story like that about this little Jewish girl, Hana, who lived with us and we never knew what happened to her." So he had heard that story all the time growing up. And so he ends up contacting this Czech journalist and says, "Was there a girl named Hana as a part of this group?" And the Czech journalist says, "Yeah. And actually, I know her family. Hannah's recently passed away, but I know her family because her granddaughter is doing this story and whatnot." So soon enough, my mom and I received emails from Knid Arne. And my mom almost immediately jumped on a plane and went to Denmark to meet Jensine, who was close to 90 years old. And then the following year, I came with her again. So that's how the relationship started. So when I went out and I started traveling and had this whole big, bold intention of I'm going to live the way my grandmother did, I reached out to Knid Arne and said, "Well, I'm coming to Denmark. I need to come live on a farm. Obviously, that's the next step." And so I said, I really kind of want to live and work and spend time the way my grandmother did. Will any of your family take me in? So he says, "I'm going to introduce you to my niece, Sine." So I ended up moving here to this incredibly beautiful place. The name of this farm is called Malabokigard, which literally translates to mill on a hill on a farm. And I moved here in 2015. And so this is Sine, named for Yen Sine, her grandmother. And Sine is the granddaughter of my grandmother's foster mother from World War II. And anytime people would ask her, like, why is this American with you? We'd be like, well, let's tell you a story of history. And it was always fun. And everybody just kind of looked at us and then they were like, well, my grandparent during the war, which always sparked good conversation. But I had reached out to Sine after Knidarne gave me her email, and he gave very little information along with the email. He was like, call Sine. So I emailed her and I said, hi, I'm Rachel. I'm this photographer from Boston. And I'm coming to do this project about my grandmother, and she lived with your grandmother and so on and so forth. I was like, can I come live with you? And she was like, yeah. And I was like, do you have any questions for me? She was like, no. I was like, all right, I'll see you in February. So that's how it started. And I came, and, the nice thing is when you have a farm, you have space to host people. So I got to live in this apartment across the street from their house that they had recently renovated and were renting out. And she let me live there. And in exchange, I helped in the barn in the morning. And in the evenings, I cooked dinner. That was my responsibility. I cooked. And it was actually, I was like 25, I guess, at this point. And this was the first time that ever in my life, I was sitting down with a family of 5 for dinner. And so I'd come off of this time in Prague where it was so lonely. My mental health was pretty bad in Prague. And I really was by myself for all this time. And I was in the middle of a city there, in the city. And then I came to the middle of nowhere, Denmark, and middle of nowhere is how Knidarne described it to me. And those are his words, but it kind of is the middle of nowhere. And suddenly I was having dinner with the family every night. And I was recognizing neighbors and waving to people. And it was so nice. But one of the things I really gained from this was I met Sina, I went in, and here I was sitting with this family who had heard about my grandmother their entire life. So when I went into this project, I had this very possessive attitude about history. I was like, oh, it's my story, my family history. There's a lot of my's and me's and I's and all that language. And suddenly I'm sitting with someone, and every morning we're working in the barn together, and, we're shoveling poop and taking care of the horses, which I was terrified of. But, she laughed at me being this inner city girl coming and trying to help her on the farm. And I'm hearing she's like, yeah, we heard about Hana forever. We didn't know what happened to her. So almost my grandmother was kind of folklore in a sense in her family. And it was very humbling to me because here was the story of my family, but through a different lens, through a different perspective. I mean, we had different languages, different religions, different cultures, different historical backgrounds, historical narratives, and our stories don't exist without each other. And this is what I would find over and over and over again in every chapter of this story. So I spent 5 weeks during that first trip with Sine. And then actually in the years that would follow, for a number of different reasons, I actually probably spent more time living on their farm than anywhere else in the world if I put it all together. So that's her husband on their farm. It was a photographer's dream. All the light was beautiful. And it was, really wonderful to get to spend time with their family. And she had 3 kids. And it was when I first met them, none of them spoke English. So the camera was a really wonderful tool of communication. Now they all speak beautiful English. And actually the youngest or the eldest, who was 11 when I met her, is now in 19, which is blows my mind because I see her on Instagram doing adult things. I'm like, what's happening? And I'm I guess I'm at that age where I'm I remember when you were. But it was really, really remarkable. So this family plays a very important role in this work. And also now anytime I'm back in Europe, they're kind of my home base when I'm there, which is really special. So we're gonna go back in time again. So let's go back to 1943 or 1942, excuse me. My grandmother had been going from farm to farm to farm. And she's now, 17 years old. And she's saying, I want to go back to school. Her education was the first thing that was taken away when the Nazis came in. And if you have an oppressive regime, education is one of the first things to go. Education means hope for the next generation. So her Danish was now good enough that she was saying, I really want to go back to school. My father always said, what you have in your head, nobody could take away from you. And he drilled that into her over and over again. So the farmer she was living with at that point said, okay, well, you can go to school if you want to go to school, but you have to figure it out. So my grandmother started writing to finishing schools because there weren't many options for women at that time. And finishing schools were like schools to teach you how to be like a proper lady. And eventually some school says, yes, they agree that in exchange for my grandmother being the custodian, essentially, she could come go to school. So this is the group of women that she went to school with there. And she always said that she really was like the true Cinderella. That's how she saw herself. And there were a number of lessons she learned from this chapter in her life, but I'm going to point out two of them. One was that she really believed that these girls hated her. She just really believed it. She had an accent. You know, she had this one old uniform that somebody gave her. It was a hand-me-down that she had to wash every night and was like always kind of wrinkled, and she never looked as nice. And when there were dances with the boys, she never went. And, you know, and instead she'd be, you know, cleaning, like, you know, taking out like the headmistress's like bedpan and things like that. And Christmas came around, and my grandmother, as the story went, was like cleaning the toilets. And the girls said, "Yo, come into the party, come to the Christmas party." And so she, you know, she went in, and they all gifted her with a silver ring and a textbook. And she said, that's when I realized they really didn't hate me. Maybe they pitied me, but they didn't hate me. And that's when I realized how important it is what's in your head. Because I was living in this reality that they like really hated me, and they didn't hate me. So that was one thing that came out for her. But also, because she didn't have textbooks prior to that experience, every night she would copy the words from her textbooks into a notebook, writing it always in a green pen. And she said she would always sit under this slanted window. And she said one night it snowed so hard that snow came in and completely washed out her notes. And it was a puddle of green ink by the morning. And she woke up and she saw these notes and she started bawling. She just lost it. And she said, you know, here I am. My parents are in concentration camps. Like, I haven't heard from them. The letters had stopped coming. I mean, she didn't know it yet, but they had already been murdered. You know, she goes, the world is crumbling around me. And here I am crying over my notes. And I think if that is not so true about all of our emotional states, sometimes it's the small things that break us. And I think it's just it is so important. And it was like such a point when she told me that story. I remember it being such a point of like connection of like, yeah, that feeling of when everything big, you're holding it together. I'm stoic. And then the small thing is what broke her. And I think it was really important for her to have that moment. So after she graduates from this school, you know, now she has all the skills to run a household, and she ends up getting hired as a maid for a banker's family. And she understood the irony there. She's like, I just went to school to learn how to like, you know, manage a maid, and now I am the maid. So it's 1943 now. As I said, for these early years of the war, Denmark had a pretty nice deal as far as the occupied countries went. 1943 comes, the war is changing. Stalingrad happens. The Nazis are starting to lose. The final solution, which was the systematic plan to murder all the Jews, was now in place. The whole tide is turning. America's in the war now. And Hitler essentially says, okay, no more preferential treatment for Denmark. So by the summer of 1943, in August, there's martial law in Denmark. The whole Danish leadership gets rounded up and arrested. And here comes a very important part of the story. There was a German officer named Georg Duckwitz, and he knows that there's about to be a roundup of the Jews. The Jews of Denmark, it's now their time, they're about to be deported. So he knows this is coming. And he leaks the information to the Danish government, to the leadership in Denmark. So this is really a moment where this man who has extreme privilege uses it in the right way, and he leaks the information. And then not only does he leak the information, he then travels over to Sweden and says, there's about to be like a mass exodus out of Denmark, and we need you to take in all the Jews. So he actually did this negotiation across borders. So the word spreads. And in September 29th, 1943, a man by the name of Rabbi Marcus Melchior stands at the head of the Copenhagen synagogue. And it's Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and he says to the community, it's not safe here for us anymore. We have to go. By nightfall, we all must be in hiding. You have to go home. You have to pack up your belongings. And not only do you have to do that, you have to then tell your neighbors, and they have to tell their neighbors, and everybody needs to know. And in about 3 weeks, by a spontaneous rescue mission, about 95% of the Jewish population get saved by being illegally ferried over to Sweden. So this starts in Copenhagen. My grandmother's at a banker's family in the countryside. She doesn't know anything, there's no Twitter. And so news doesn't travel the way it does now. So as she told me her story, it's now October 1943. And she says to me, she was like, Rachel, this is the most dramatic part coming up. She says, one day, a young man I had never seen before and never after comes to the banker and he says, do you have a Jewish servant here? The banker says, yes, little Hana. And he came and he says to me, do you have a bike? I said, yes. He says, get on the bike and follow me. I'm going to add that when my grandmother was telling me this story, she said, if you ever get on a bike and follow a random man, I will kill you. She goes, it was a different time. I said, yes, Mati, I promise. She continued, she said, I followed him to a fishing village, to a church. The minister of the church took me up to the bell tower. I was told to wait for the signal and cover my ears when the church bell was rung. We ran to the beach. We hid in the sand under the upside down rowboats. The fishermen wanted some financial compensation for bringing us to Sweden. So we got the signal and ran from the upside down rowboats to the fishing boat, which was supposed to take us to Sweden. I knew that the fishermen would not take me. I have no money. I turn my pockets inside out to show the fisherman. He looks at me in the eyes and says, I didn't ask you, did I? Hop on board. My grandmother's story is narrated over and over again by nameless, faceless strangers who did their part to save her life. And what's so remarkable about the rescue of the Danish Jews, not only that 95% of the Jewish population was saved, and not only that while they were in Sweden during the rest of the war, that all of their neighbors watered their plants and no one appropriated their belongings. And when the Jews came back at the end of the war, there were parades welcoming them home. That all was special. But for me, what I think is so remarkable is that in Denmark, everyone did what they could. And sometimes that was as simple as just staying silent. Everybody played their role that they were able to play in society. And this is a wonderful example of how that looks different for everybody. One man could ferry, one man could go on the bike, one man could spread the word, one woman could spread the word. Like everybody did what they could. So my grandmother gets on a boat October 8th, 1943. Got a little lag on the video here. Gets on a boat October 8th, 1943. It's a very dramatic night. I'm not going to go into it. You have to read the book for that. But it's a very dramatic night. It was supposed to be like a 7-hour crossing to Sweden. They're on the boat for 18, 19 hours. They're not seeing shore. The sun is rising. Had they landed in any shoreline aside for Sweden, they almost certainly would have been killed and are shot. Like shot, killed, drowned, or deported, one or the other. Sweden was the only safe place for them to go. So eventually the sun is rising. They see a little shore in the distance, which is very terrifying because they don't know where they are. This man who was, the captain of the boat, he had never actually been out at sea where he couldn't see the shore before. He had a compass. He didn't know how to use it. He was trying to do the right thing, but maybe was in a little bit over his head, which most people were at their time. But as the story goes, well, actually, before I get there, my grandmother was telling me at this time, she said, on this boat with me was a very famous family. Said this family with the last name Melchior. So if you remember, there was a rabbi named Melchior, spread the word. So she said, yeah, he was on the boat with his wife and the kids. So when, this name Melchior family, I knew was a fairly prominent name still to this day. The grandson of this rabbi was in the Knesset in Israel, and the name had come up around me. So when I went to Denmark, I said, I got to find this family, right? This is what I'm trying to do. So I reached out to the Jewish community and kind of told them the story. And very soon after, I was introduced to this gentleman. And so this is Rabbi Bent Melchior, son of Marcus Melchior. And as a 14-year-old boy, Bent was on the same boat as my grandmother. And I walked into his home just a few days before I met Sine with this very bold claim and said, you were on the same refugee boat as my grandmother in 1943. And we started exchanging details and said, yes, okay, in fact, this probably was the same boat ride because it got lost. And there are all these details that matched up, but some perspectives were different. And we started talking about this. And, he's asking me stories about my grandmother and about who she was and where she came from. And he says, it's remarkable. Your grandmother had already been a refugee for all those years. I became a refugee that night. And we both had the same chance of survival. So Bent and I became very close. We met in 2015. If you remember, in 2015, 2016, there was a refugee crisis that came to the front of international attention. I have to kind of work on my language now because I used to say that was the current refugee crisis. And of course, we're in a different time now. So I'm trying to work through how to talk about that. But this was, hundreds and thousands of people coming up from the Middle East and Africa. And so what had started as conversations with him about the past very soon became about the present. And we worked through that together. And Bent and I actually became really close. And eventually I adopted him as my grandfather and he adopted me as his granddaughter. And we walked with each other through a lot of moments in life. And he passed away last year, sadly. But he spent his entire life fighting for refugee rights. So we had all these really powerful conversations. And he was able to fill in some stories for me. He said, so that morning, we were so scared that where were we going to end up going? He goes, but on shore that morning in Sweden, which is where they were, he said there was a 6-year-old boy and it was his birthday and he was playing football by the shore and saw a boat out at sea. And even though Sweden was neutral, it was not normal to see a boat out at sea. That was wartime. And even though Sweden wasn't involved, they were still by default, involved. And so this young boy runs to tell his father that there's this boat out at sea, and the father takes his rowboat with a neighbor, and they go out to sea, and suddenly these figures emerge from the fog, and they say these 3 sweet words of welcome to Sweden. So Bent tells me that story, and he says, I know this exact place. I know where it is. So a few weeks later, I find myself in that exact place, and I'm gonna let Bent say the words to you that I think are very, very powerful.
When I am standing there at the beach, looking at that water, I see myself on the bottom of that sea.
So not only does he tell me exactly where this spot is, which was a question I didn't even know I could ask. I just didn't, it's like one of those things you don't know what to ask till you know information. So that's looking out at the water. He says, so I'm still in touch with this family. So if you turn just around from that spot where I was, this is the house behind me. It has all these flags in front. And it turns out that the Melchior family stayed very close with this fisherman's family, the Pearson family. And every year on October 9th, the anniversary of the rescue, which was also this little boy's birthday, the families would exchange letters. And when I first showed up to this house and I saw all these flags, I'm just in kind of the middle of nowhere, southern Sweden, it's a tiny little fishing village. And I'm like, what is with all these flags? So when I asked the folks inside who you are about to meet, they said, well, these are all flags of countries where they donate money to kids in need, which I just think was really beautiful. So this is Per Arne, and this was the 6-year-old boy who spotted the boat. He, a remarkable man. I know he had a very good sense of humor, even though he didn't speak English, because whenever I would talk with him and his daughter would translate the best she could for me, she would never translate the jokes. And I'd be like, come on, you gotta translate jokes. She was like, no, they're too dirty. And I was like, So one day I'll have somebody in Swedish listen to all the tapes I took of them and tell me just exactly how dirty they were. But he had a very good sense of humor. But I met him, and I had reached out to him after Bent put me in touch, and I, came to him and told him the story and said, my grandmother came into your house in 1943, and thank you. You helped save her life. And as Bent said, this man did a good deed without knowing he did a good deed. And what was remarkable, just to follow this theme of this is not actually my history, it's all of our histories. I walk into their home and it is like a museum to this history. They have, they're not Jewish, they have Israeli flags hanging, they have newspaper articles everywhere framed about this rescue. This paper here you see lit up is from the 70th anniversary. Next year will be the 80th. where it's Bent and Par'arne standing out at the water. Par'arne's wife really inherited this history to herself, and she kept, she had this like big 3-ring binder that had every single correspondence ever sent between the Melchior family and the Pearson family in it. And at the end was like my email to them. And it was just remarkable. The first time I visited them in 2015, I brought them pictures of my grandmother because I would do that a lot. And then I gifted them to them. And the next year I came back in 2016 and the pictures were framed, hung up on the wall. This rescue, this one day in 1943 was such a big part of this family's identity from one generation to the next. And that's just what kept happening with this story. I kept traveling and I kept meeting people and I kept finding out that like this lives so deeply in the identity of all these people from such different vantage points, from such different perspectives. So we're going to end quite soon, but I want to end with some words from Bent and then I'll end with some words from my grandmother. And there's, of course, much more of this history. I'm just taking you through these early years of the war, but my work follows my grandmother's history into America, and she spent 6 years here as a stateless person as well. But I want to let you listen to Bent talk about going to this home, because he and I traveled over there together in 2017. And I'll say he drove me from Copenhagen over to Sweden. He was like 89 years old at the time. And I was living with Sine at the time, and she was like, "Bent's going to drive you? Feel okay?" Like, yeah, he was older, and like he walked very slowly. And every time we walked, I had to we like held his hand and everything. And I'll say when we got to his car in Copenhagen, it was like the oldest car I'd ever seen. And and it was like banged up. I said, "Bent, this is your car?" Like, I was like, "You were the former chief rabbi of Denmark." He was like, "Oh, I didn't want them to think the community paid me too much. It's like, oh, well, the car's," I said, "How old is this car?" He was like, "Oh, 1989. I was like, "That's the year I was born, man." And then like the side mirror was gone. And I was like, "Bent, the side mirror, where is it?" He was, "Oh, I've looked in the mirror for 89 years. I don't need to look in the mirror anymore." I go, "That's not how cars work, And then we got over to Sweden and he pulls over to the side of the road, and he I wasn't traveling with a smartphone at that time. Like, I just hadn't graduated to that yet. And he, had just like, I guess you call it an analog phone. I don't even know what to call it now. It's an old cell phone. And he pulls out like MapQuest out of his pocket, and it was like directions in Danish for Sweden, and he hands them to me to navigate. I'm like, "I don't speak Danish, I don't speak Swedish." But eventually we made it, and we had a lovely afternoon, and it was like the most wonderful. And we all just sat around and we ate cake and we drank coffee and we talked, and the conversation was like Swedish and English and Danish, and it was just this really beautiful moment. And so this is Bent talking about what it's like to be in that house.
It is something outstanding. You enter this place, it's not a big place, and you feel something special because they collected every little bit, every note in any newspaper, and all the small things that my mother used to send them on the anniversary of our coming there. It is in a shrine. It smells of what something happened. A place is not holy by itself. It's a question of the people that are there that make the place a holy place. It is the actions by human beings that can change a place from a normal house into a holy place. And I think that is kind of feeling I have to enter this little house.
It's actually a small clip from the podcast. And there's a whole episode in the podcast that's just about the rescue, and you get to hear Par'arne and their family as well in it. So my grandmother spends the remainder of the war in Sweden. She does the same thing she did in Denmark. She exchanges being a custodian to get a nursing degree. She figures it out, and then the war ends. And I think that some can make the case this is when the survivor's story begins, because now you have this question of, where do I go? What do I do? My family is gone, my home is gone, my national identity is gone, my papers are gone. Like, what do I do? And so, as my grandmother said, everyone was going somewhere because everyone was a displaced person, particularly the people who survived the concentration camp. So the story continues. I'm gonna to wrap it up in a moment, but she goes back to Denmark because there was a rumor that if you had escaped Denmark, you could go back and get Danish citizenship, and citizenship was so important at that time for her to get. But that rumor proved to be false, so she goes back to Czechoslovakia to see who's left and starts to collect some of the family belongings and collect the papers that prove her parents' death, which are important also to prove her victimhood, right? How do you prove that you're a victim? And then decides not to stay there and goes back to Scandinavia and eventually comes to America in 1950. And it would be 6 years before she got her American citizenship. So I followed her story across America. I actually took the train all the way from New York across to San Francisco. And one thing I just want to note about the difference of digging into history like this from an American versus European perspective is how, when I was in Europe and I would tell people, I'd meet people on trains or wherever I was and say, kind of give them the cliff notes of what I was doing. And there was kind of this attitude, and it was a gentle, kind attitude, but of like, yeah, well, everybody has a story. Like all of our families were there, right? We all it was like unique that I was there, but it wasn't unique that this happened. And then here in America, I'd be on like a train and talking to people, and it was like, everybody was so engaged in a way that all they wanted to do was know about their family history too. And it was like this hunger of wanting to know where we came from. And I thought that was a very interesting observation because so often I would meet people in this country that just didn't know how to answer that question and almost felt a little lost that they couldn't. And I just never really found that in Europe. And so I found that to be an interesting difference. So to end, I'm going to end with my grandmother's own words. So my grandmother wrote her own eulogy. If you can't tell by this point in the story, she had some chutzpah. She had some opinions about herself and how life should be. And back in the mid 1990s, she went to, this is like 15 years before she passed away. She went to a friend's funeral and really didn't like the eulogy. She actually found it to be like very, she found it to be like just very impersonal, and she like didn't like what the rabbi wrote. So she went home and wrote her own eulogy so that wouldn't happen to her. And it's beautiful. And in the book is the full thing. But I just want to read a little segment of it to wrap up here, and then we can do some question and answers. But she writes, "We all live on borrowed time. Our lives are temporary, and most of us try to do our best to our parents, our siblings, our spouses, our children and grandchildren, our friends, and our community. Some of us succeed for the most part. We do have the strength and the optimism to hope, to go on, to be productive, to be concerned, to love, to discipline, to rejoice, and to support. We are putting our hopes in our children and the future generations. They will have the same struggles, agonies, and pleasures we had. However, they cannot learn it through us. They have to experience all of the emotions, from exhilarating to mournful ones, on their own. All we can do is instill in the new generation a moral fiber, sense of justice, loyalty, love for learning, awe of nature, respect for each other, enjoy life's pleasures, and cope with setbacks. All this we give through love and example." So I'm going to pause it there. Thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you to the museum for having me. This is really wonderful. And I'm happy to do questions if anyone has them, or if any came in on Zoom. Yeah.
Did your grandmother refer to herself as a survivor? For my family, that's always been a question, because if you didn't survive the camps, could they call themselves?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'll repeat the questions for folks on Zoom to be able to hear better. So the question is if my grandmother considered herself a survivor, which is a good question, because there is some question about, like, if are you a survivor of the camps or survivor? Yes, she absolutely considered herself a survivor, but this is a question that does come up in the survivor community. And there are some opinions about it, but I think that from a more general academic perspective, if you were a Jew that was from Europe, that you were still alive at the end of the war, you survived. And that was an identity that they had a choice. But I will say, I work with a lot of Holocaust survivors, and what's been so interesting to me when I asked them this question is that a lot of them didn't start identifying as survivor until many, many years later. That was not an identity that came right away. There's this one woman that I've become quite close with in recent years, in her early 90s. And she said a rabbi actually had to tell her she was a survivor at one point because she was able to get out through Shanghai. A lot of people got out that way. But it is interesting. And there's some people who have strong opinions on that, but yeah, absolutely considered herself a survivor. Yeah. Questions? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, sure. I was saying this earlier tonight. So there's a blossoming exhibition. I'm actually working with so this is clearly a multimedia project. I started as a photographer. There was actually a podcast that came out in 2019 prior to the book that is a narrative podcast. And actually that was created with intention of being used in the classroom. So if any educators out there, every single episode of the podcast comes with lesson plans that teachers can use right away. And now I'm working on a museum exhibit. So I'm actually working with a Holocaust museum down in Florida to create a traveling museum exhibit that will go around the country and international, that will include artifacts and photographs and videos, and also some original content I'll create for it. So that's the next step, which is, I kind of had this thought that maybe when the book came out, I would go on to another project, but I think the work is keeping me here for a bit. So I'm about to do a whole other new deep dive into the archive, which is probably going to be a little bit painful because I'm going to find all this beautiful stuff that didn't make it into the book, but hopefully it'll live in another space. Yeah.
So much. I'm curious about your writing process. You collect all the material and then assemble it, or how you organize it all?
Sure. So question is about writing process. This has been a very long project, and had anybody told me I was going into a 10-year long body of work, I would have said there's no way I'm doing a 10-year long project. But I kind of think that's how the best stories unfold, is they just keep going, and it kept getting interesting. I had a whole version of a manuscript written like 7-8 years ago. There were a couple of things that happened in this work that really changed it, that are in the podcast and the book that I didn't go into tonight. The first was the refugee crisis that broke out in 2015 and 2016. So that place in Sweden where I was, southern Sweden, when I first arrived there, the Persson family took me to this house. It was like a B&B, and said, this is where your grandmother stayed her very first night here before she was quarantined by the Red Cross and then taken to kind of a holding place for refugees. So I took some pictures and whatnot. When I came back the next year, where I was much more focused on the refugee crisis because I knew it was unfolding. I was watching everything happening in the news. And I said, well, I'd like to go back to this house and just take some more photographs of it. And when I got there, this woman comes out, I'm taking pictures, and this woman comes out of the house and says, no pictures, no pictures. And I was like, well, why? And it turned out there were young refugees living in that place again, who had come by sea on their own, under the age of 18, without their parents, and were trying to find refuge in Sweden. And that was the start of what I started to refer to as like my contemporary chapter. So I actually started working with young people in Denmark and in Sweden who had come over during the refugee crisis without their families. And so that changed the story. And the other thing that happened was my own personal life was unfolding during this time. So there's someone that you meet in the book and the podcast. His name was Sergio. And he was my best friend and my husband. And we started dating because I moved to Europe and he lived in Poland. We had met as students in Israel, wasn't Jewish, lived in Poland. And when I started traveling for this work, he and I very quickly went from friends to let's get married. And so he was a really important part of this body of work in terms of helping me navigate Europe from an identity perspective, because it was, I'm an American. I'm a total American, like trying to explore my family history in Europe. And then I was like brought into his family and suddenly had this like European perspective now, and this European family that I would go home to in between. And so he immigrated with me here after I finished this first year of travel, and just a year before our first wedding anniversary. Actually, we were married in Northport. So we got married, and that's in the book. And just under a year, he passed away after we were married. He died from a heart attack when he was 28. And so I was 27 at that time when I was widowed, and that completely changed the story. So I had already written a full book prior to that happening. And so a lot of what this story has become is how the past changes as our present moves forward, or maybe not how the past changes, but how we bring it with us differently into the future. So those two events happened around the same time, the refugee crisis and me being widowed. And so essentially I just like completely threw out that manuscript and was like, well, the story kind of feels different now. And I actually ended up retracing this whole story all over again. That's okay. I started retracing this whole story all over again with like grief as a narrator, because I had this moment of saying, you know, I can't, like, how do I talk about this story as an uplifting story, which is what my grandmother called it, without acknowledging grief, without understanding grief. And so the book kind of dives into that as well. But it was multiple revisions over and over again. And I will say, when I first set out to do this as like, you know, someone in my young 20s, I thought it was gonna be like a travelogue book, because that was the type of writing I was like used to writing. And then it just got more intense as time went on. But I have to say, I'm glad it came out prior to this moment in time, because I couldn't keep up with the news now if I tried, in terms of how to weave it all in. So yeah.
I get the impression that it's very difficult for a lot of, I'm going to take this out for a second, for a lot of Jews who are of European background to go back to Europe and find any vestige of the life that was left behind. I don't know how unique, I think your project is unique. I don't know how unique your story is of being able to go back and find something. I always feel in my heart like that's kind of a dead end for most people who came from families that were affected by the Holocaust, because there is no there. And yet I'm so heartened by the fact that you had so much that you could find. And I think I feel like that's unique, and I wonder if it is, and if you could speak to that at all. If other people, I know some people go back and find things, but so much was destroyed. And then you have this treasure trove of people, places, and things that are reality. And so many of us can find nothing from what was left. There's like not a trace.
Yeah. So the question is pertaining to like, how unique is it of what I was able to find going back in Europe? I think there's kind of there's the two communities. There's the communities that inherit so much story that they almost don't know what to do with it, and it feels like a burden and a responsibility and a weight, depending on the day, and a privilege on other days. And then there's the communities that you're talking about, the families that have nothing, and it might be that they have nothing because they ran with literally nothing on their back and never went home. It might be they have nothing because they changed their family name when they came over here, which was very common. So you don't even know how to start going back to find out if there is anything. And there might be nothing because of what the contemporary space looks like in Europe, what country they ended up coming from. And sometimes it's a combination of all three. It is unique what I have, for certain, 100% certain. If I could go back and ask my grandmother anything, one of the questions I would ask her is, how did you save all of this? Because I didn't know, I was 20, I didn't know all of this exists. I didn't have the thought to ask that question. I have like an educated guess of how I have it all, but it is unique. And she clearly kept it with intention. She cared. The other piece that was unique about this was that because her story was contingent on the kindness of strangers, in their story, it was a good story. And that's what I kept hearing. In Sine's family, it was a good story. They saved somebody during the war. In Arne's family, it was a good story. They saved 19 people during the war. You know, even in Ben's family, of course, it was a good story. You know, they all came back alive at the end of the war. That is unique also. So when I went out and started to find these people, they were proud of what their families did. They had inherited something that was empowering to them of who they could be for other people in the world. And so in that sense, it was unique as well. I do know lots of other people who found lots of information about their family. So it is doable to find, but, you know, there's also a changing landscape in Europe. So, you know, just speaking to contemporary day, like anybody who has family history from what is now modern day Ukraine, those sites are getting bombed. So there's been a lot of memorial work done in Ukraine over the past many years, particularly from a French priest named Father Dubois, who's done a lot of beautiful memory work of uncovering mass graves there that has offered some memory for folks who had no memory, like physical, and now those places are getting bombed, right? So when we think about how we hold these spaces as time moves forward, a lot of it depends on what the country is, where can you go into, obviously the countries that were under communism after the war, I think it's much harder to find information there than a place like Scandinavia. Yeah. But also there's lots of resources out there. So if you want to follow up with me, there might be ways to find some stuff if you're speaking personally. Yeah. Yeah.
More of a thank you and a comment. When you were showing it and showing the video of that small town in Sweden, small house in Sweden, the words that came to my mind were that on a dreidel that's played within the US, the 4 letters stand for a great miracle happened there. And I kept on saying to myself, there should be a dreidel in that house. This is a great miracle happened here.
Oh my gosh, I love that. You make me cry. That's beautiful. Yeah, absolutely. The next time I go visit that family, maybe I'll bring them a dreidel. And I'm gonna let them know you said. I will.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. That's a beautiful way to end. And so thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it.